Good morning.
Good morning.
In my meditation, I was traveling around the world in memory. And not only around the world, but probably around the calendar also. And I was seeing the two rooms where the Infinite Way activity started in Hollywood. First in the living room of my home, and then in an office. I traveled to San Francisco, where our first meeting consisted of a group of 12 people, and then all that has happened since in Portland, Seattle, Victoria, Vancouver, Chicago, New York, Europe, Africa, down under. Sitting out on the grass in India, talking to a group of 40 or 50 students one day, and a group of 200 students, not of the Infinite Way, but of Oriental teachings. Back here to Hawaii, where we sat on the grass out on the lanai of the Halekulani Hotel, or across the street in a tiny apartment of Nidra's on Kalia Road. Out in Kahala, where we spoke to 7 students and gave the Thunder of Silence tape. I was seeing all of these small groups that have heard this message, and the larger ones, the classes, finally even halls with 1,000 to 1,500 people. Going on like this for more than 15 years, with increased fruitage, increased activity, and yet always returning to groups like this one, with work such as we have had this last 6 months. And I could see that the entire fruitage of the work, the success of the message, its spread, is due primarily to the work done in the small groups like this, where you have dedicated consciousness. Dedicated not to a man or a movement, but dedicated to the attainment of God realization. It is a more difficult thing to explain to the larger groups the meaning of these small meetings, of what transpires in such meetings, and the effect that these meetings have on the entire world, on all of human consciousness. Because where people are interested in a message, primarily because it is going to affect their health, or their supply, or their home relationships, you have quite a different story than where you are met together for no personal purpose. That has been the function of these small groups in every part of the world where we have small groups, where we have had groups like this. And certainly in the whole history of our work in the Hawaiian Islands, where we have always had these small groups, the difference is that the dedication is not for the purpose of attaining something for ourselves, but rather of contributing something to human consciousness. Not neglecting the fact that I myself must be lifted up in order to draw the world unto me, but remembering that the purpose of being lifted up is to draw the world unto me. It is not being lifted up just so that I may make a better demonstration of life, or you, but that in our elevation, the world likewise would be elevated to that degree. The consciousness of a group of dedicated people, what the Master called 2 or more gathered together in my name, must be a leavening influence to all of human consciousness. This only becomes apparent to you when you realize that in the spiritual universe there is no such thing as time or space. The people in South Africa are not separated from us by time or space, nor those in Australia or New Zealand or London. The moment we unite in consciousness, we are all in one place of one mind. And what the map may testify to as to time or space is of no purpose whatsoever. You have the proof of that, of course, in spiritual healing, where you have already seen that There is no necessity at all of being in the physical presence of the healer. That regardless of where you may be in time or space, the moment you unite with Christ consciousness, you are one with it. And neither time nor space enters into the demonstration at all. However, there is one thing that does enter into it, and that really is what I'm leading up to. Last week, in opening my Bible, I had one of those accidents that you are all so familiar with, of just opening to a place that happened to be lit with electric lights. It was the 16th chapter of Mark, which is the very last chapter, and the very last verse. The Master has just ascended and left the disciples. Again, he had been alone with his small group, but he ascended and he left. This is what we then read. And they went forth and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them and confirming the word with signs following. Just think what that does to you when you realize that they went forth and preached everywhere, but how useless that would have been except for the next. The Lord working with them and confirming the word with signs following. What good is preaching without signs following? What good is teaching without signs following? What is the good of telling this truth to anyone without signs following? What is the use of publishing a Bible or a metaphysical book or a mystical book without signs following? And how could there be signs following if the Lord was not working with them? If the Lord is not in the revelation of Scripture that becomes a Bible, if the Lord is not working in the consciousness of an individual who writes a book on metaphysics or mysticism, if the Lord is not working with the person teaching or revealing or preaching, how do you get the signs following, since I of my own self can do nothing? If I speak of myself, I bear witness to a lie. If there is not a transcendental presence acting with me, that comes back again to our last Sunday morning talk, where we had the 1 Corinthians, 1st and 2nd chapters, in all of which Paul made it clear that Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach, and not to preach in words of men's wisdom, but to preach the Holy Ghost. And this must always be with signs following. We have so much of preaching in the world, so much of teaching in the world, and so little of signs following. The reason is that we attempt to preach or that we attempt to teach without being certain that the Lord is working with us. For one of us ever to get up to speak on the infinite way, or to teach it, or to preach it, without signs following, would be definite evidence that we do not have the Lord with us. In other words, that we had not meditated to the point of realization. This alone should be a guide for every student of the infinite way, now and for the next 1,000 generations, that before speaking the word of the infinite way, before preaching it or teaching it, be sure that there has been a sufficient meditation to reach that point of realization, so that you know the Lord is working with me and there will be signs following. To some people who have a natural facility for reading, remembering, being able to repeat, it is not too difficult to teach or preach a spiritual or metaphysical message. But the difficulty is in having the signs following. It may be a mystery to the rest of the world how you attain this Lord working with you. And in fact, that is the mystery. There are very few teachings on the face of the globe that tell you how the unillumined human becomes the illumined human, or how the I of my own self that can do nothing can become the preacher with signs following. It is clear from the very beginning of this infinite way message that we have solved that riddle of the universe, and the answer is, meditate until the Spirit of the Lord God is upon you. Meditate until you actually feel that divine presence and can witness by your fruitage that the Lord is working with you. In other words, it is not true, as many teachings would claim, that a long period of time is necessary, or that sacrifice and asceticism is necessary, or sitting in a certain position, or fasting, or attending schools. This is not the answer. The answer is very simple. Meditate until you know that your meditation has resulted in a contact with the transcendental presence and power that is already established within you. As a matter of fact, even meditation is not as difficult as it appears to most people. If, when you sit down to meditate, you realize you are not going to God for anything, you are not hoping to influence God to do anything, you are not expecting God to come down out of heaven and pick you out to do special favors for. In other words, when you learn to release God in the realization God is, you cannot question that. You would not be in this study if you questioned that, because you must, first of all, have an inner feeling that God is, a conviction that requires no proof. If you need any proof or reasoning power, you might just as well give up the search and lead as good a human life as you are capable of, because you are not going to attain your spiritual vision. There is no way of providing proof for anyone that God exists, and there is no proof that will prove it. Scripture is clear that if you raise them from the dead, it will not convince them, and we have witnessed that. We have witnessed that over and over and over again, that regardless of how much proof you give anyone, heal them of this or that or the other thing, bring about increased supply, bring about happiness in their home, and that does not convince them. Because on the spiritual level of life, there is nothing that can happen to you humanly that will convince you of a spiritual cause. Everything that can happen to you as a result of your spiritual studies has happened to some people without them. People have become millionaires without becoming spiritual. People have had good health without becoming spiritual. People have had happy human relationships without becoming spiritual. People have gone through all their lives without serious problems, without becoming spiritual. Therefore, just having some good human circumstance happen to you should be no proof whatsoever that there is a God. God cannot be proved. God can be experienced, and then can arise an inner conviction that God is. But this is not based on a reasoning process, a thinking process, or on any proof that can be offered. The person who believes in God because of some proof has a weak foundation for their faith. He hangeth the earth on nothing. And if you are to believe in God at all, it must be for no reason no reason of the external universe. It must be an inner conviction without any need of an outside proof. Even the fact that only God can make a tree should not be necessary. And as a matter of fact, that does not prove it to all people. There are many people who witness all the trees that we do and still can be atheistic. On the other hand, the so-called atheistic scientists of Russia are becoming convinced that there is a spiritual cause behind the material foundation. In other words, this is not based on any proof they have had, but a conviction that has come to the heart, a conviction that has come to the soul. So it is. If there is anybody that wants proof of the infinite way, they may have it, but it will not prove anything to them, and it will be a weak foundation for their faith, because the next time they demand some proof and it is not forthcoming, they have nothing left to stand on. In the spiritual realm, then, we operate on an entirely different basis than the material. The spirit is a different dimension of life or consciousness. Its values are different. Its modes, its means, its activities differ from those of the material or the mental realm. And one thing about it, you can be sure, that on the spiritual level of consciousness, there is no such thing as proof. There is only an inner conviction. Whereas before I was blind, now I see. I do not know if this man healed me or if this teaching healed me. I only know, whereas before I was blind, now I see. Therefore, I know there is a something, not because of the evidence, but because I was blind and now I see, because my inner spiritual faculties were dammed up, and now they are opened, and I see and I feel and I have conviction. In every instance, and I give you this 16th chapter of Mark, 20th verse, make it sort of shibboleth, make it a sort of password. And they went forth and preached everywhere, the Lord working with them, and confirming the word with signs following. So that you realize that you have no right to live any day at all without the Lord living with you. For the day will not be too successful if you do. We must not undertake any undertaking except we have the conviction that the Lord is working with me, because otherwise we can only hope for success. And then if we have it, it really will not be anything that we can boast about, because it could be undone. Make this a part of our experience, that one of the functions of the entire Infinite Way message is to bring us to a state of consciousness whereby we do not undertake anything, whereby we do not live, and certainly do not preach or teach, until in our meditation we have received the inner go-ahead sign that says the Lord is working with us. And then we will only be sure that the Lord is working with us by the signs following. Because if the Lord is working with us, you can be assured that whereas before they were blind, they will see. Whereas before they were sick, they will be well. Whereas before they were poor, they will be rich. And whereas before they were unhappy, they will be happy. Whereas before they were not comforted, they will now be comforted. In other words, in every avenue of life, there will be signs following. This brings us to another of the important mileposts of the Infinite Way, and one which will, like the first one here, this one also will enable you to check yourself, check up on yourself, to see whether you are falling by the wayside or whether you are continuing on the beam. This point requires an active practice on your part as I speak to you. You will have to follow me, not merely by hearing me, but by actually following me in an act of consciousness. I will state it this way. God's grace functions only in the immediate now. I want you now to follow me with your own consciousness. God's grace functions only in the immediate now. God's grace functions only in the immediate now. Now, while I am pondering this statement, now while I am sitting here listening, now while I am in a state of receptivity, God's grace is functioning in me and through me, in this universe and through this universe. God's grace is functioning in the consciousness of mankind everywhere on earth, but only now. Now, while I am in this state of receptivity, I am aware that now there is a life force permeating these trees and flowers. Right now, there is a life force permeating every tree and every plant out there. Right now, there is a life force permeating the ocean, the fish under the waves. Right now, in this immediate now, that you are consciously receptive, right now the grace of God is developing a sap in the roots in what will appear to be tomorrow or next week or next month, will appear outwardly as blossoms and buds, and then finally as flowers or fruit. However, nothing is going to happen next week or next month except for the grace of God that is functioning in this universe this second. So remember, the coconuts that appear next week are appearing because of a grace that is functioning in the coconut tree this moment. If there were no grace functioning in this moment, there would be no coconuts next week. If there were no grace functioning out there in the sea, there would not be the rising or the ebbing of the tides throughout these days, weeks, months, and years. As you are consciously aware, as you follow me, that a grace, a presence of God, a power of God is functioning in all nature, in all human consciousness, can you see that you could not make God function yesterday? Can you see how impossible it would be to go back and get God to function yesterday? Could you remove God from the functioning of this instant? Could you make God retrograde into yesterday and do something? Could God go back to yesterday and start functioning? Of course not. There is only now in the spiritual kingdom. There is only this moment. And there is only this continuing moment. It is because of this continuing moment that everything that happens in the future is going to happen because of this continuing moment. Could you possibly, follow this closely, could you possibly get God to function tomorrow, now, today? Could you this moment get God to do something tomorrow? Could you get God outside of this instantaneous moment? Of course you cannot. You cannot get God outside of this split second. You cannot move God backwards or forward. Whatever God is to do, God is doing now. Do you see then that every moment that you live in the past, you are living without God? You are living a godless life every moment that you waste living in the past. Because there is nothing God can do about it, because God is not there. God is here, and God is now. The place whereon I stand is holy ground now. If anything is to take place in my life, in what we call a future, it has to be as a continuing of the presence of the now God, the God of now. I cannot get God to operate tomorrow. The tomorrow operation of God is dependent on the now operation of God, because God is only functioning in this split second. And every continuing split second, God is functioning. That is why even God does not take a rosebud and an hour later have it into a full-blown rose, because God functions now. And then we, being in the functioning of now, unfold in accord with the nature of our being. But we could not do this without God. And we cannot get God to do it yesterday. And we cannot get God to do it tomorrow. The tomorrowness of God is solely due to the nowness of God. Now, in this split second, God is God. And God is an eternal God, because God is functioning eternally in the now, but not in the past and not in the future. So when you are living in the future, you are living as godless a life as if you were living in the past. Everything must be predicated on now. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. And that means that as ye sow now, so will you reap. Because in the act of sowing, you are in that God consciousness that determines the nature of the reaping. We, in this message, while honoring the good of the past, and while setting our plans for an harmonious future, can only do this in the realization that the future cannot be any more harmonious than the sowing that we do in the now. If we do not sow spiritually now, there will be no spiritual fruitage later, because the spiritual fruitage of tomorrow is the product of the spiritual sowing of now. That is why all karma can be erased at any moment, because the results of karma can only last while the seeds of karma are operating. And the moment a person moves out of the material consciousness where they sowed materially, there is no more material reaping, because they are not even there. They have died. In any moment that they have died to the past, they have been reborn in this nowness, in this second, and in their rebirth of the spirit, they carry with them nothing of the past, any more than the butterfly carries anything of the worm. The worm dies and the butterfly is born. The butterfly has no recollection of the worm. Any moment in which we meditate and have the conscious realization of the presence of God, in that moment we have died to our materialism. The birth of the Christ has taken place. It can take place 20 times a day in meditation, and at each time it will wipe out any part of the human past that continues to intrude. So you see how necessary it is to have periods in which you consciously live as though you were looking right down this lane now, seeing nothing of the past, being not concerned what I shall eat or drink in the future, but now. I and my Father are consciously one. Now I and the Father are one, and all that the Father hath is mine. The place whereon I stand is holy ground. All that God is, I am in the now. Then when I have been silent, and this has been confirmed in me, now God is working with me. Now I can go ahead. And if I have to arrange for plans for next week or next year, I can do it. I can plan for 10 years ahead, if after that meditation I am given any plans to plan. That does not make it an act of the future. That makes it an act of the present extending forward. When we say that we do not make plans for the future, that is true in one sense and not true in another sense. Let me go back a few months and say that I had no plans and made no plans for 1962. Yes, but then came this awareness. Oh, there should be a class in California. There should be a class in Chicago. All this was in the present, that these ideas were presenting themselves to me. They were in a present moment that these ideas came. Then I could go ahead with plans of a human nature, reserving rooms, halls, sending out notices. I was not planning for the future. The whole idea came in the present, and the carrying out of it might be considered a continuation of this present. In that sense, then, we plan for the future. We order our tickets ahead or arrange for hotels or whatever is necessary. But that does not mean planning in the future in the human sense of where we make up our minds what we are going to do in the future and plan accordingly. The plans for the future are only the product of God working with us now and revealing to us that there should be a class in July. The minute that conviction comes, there should be a class in Honolulu in July. In that moment, then, we say, make all plans. But that was not human planning. That was taking the human footsteps, following the divine plan that was revealed to us. You have to see that worrying about the past, being concerned about the past, or having a guilt complex about the past is a waste of time, because there is no God in the past, and you might as well get out of it. If God is out of it, you get out of it too. Neither is there any use of undue concern about the future, except insofar as plans for the future are the natural products of ideas that are given to you in the present of what to do about the future. Certainly, if you have a child going to school, you must plan for it. But the idea is, do not have the child going to school until God has given you the signal that God is working with you. And to that end and that conviction, you only get in your meditations. On the tape, a parenthesis in eternity, and in that work of which you were a part, there is either a direct statement or inference that should be rightly understood. We spoke of the parenthesis in eternity, and we visualized by looking at a ring and then seeing a parenthesis at one part of the ring and saying that parenthesis represents our human span. There may have been an inference there that death removes that parenthesis and puts us back into the ring of the eternal life, eternity, but that was not its meaning. Death does not necessarily remove that parenthesis, because if we pass from this stage in a human sense of life, we awaken in a human sense of life, so we awaken in another parenthesis. It is still a parenthesis on the other side of the grave. The wiping out of the parenthesis is accomplished as an activity of consciousness, not an activity of dying or being born. In other words, the parenthesis is human life. The removing of the parenthesis is when you die to your humanhood and are reborn of your spiritual identity. And that is not a physical death. That is the death of dying daily and being reborn. Therefore, it is really an act of consciousness. You remove yourself from the parenthesis while you are still here on earth. If you do not do it while you are still here on earth, you will still have the opportunity afterward. But the passing itself does not remove the parenthesis and place you in eternity, because you awaken from death in another parenthesis if you awaken in another human state of consciousness. So, the removing of the parenthesis is an activity also of meditation, in which you realize, whereas before I was blind, now I see, I and the Father are one, there is but one life. The moment we perceive that there is but one life, and I am living that life, the parenthesis has been removed. At least it has been so rubbed out, there is only a faint trace of it left. There may, for centuries to come, be faint traces of that parenthesis left in the lives of all of us. But it will not be a hard and fast parenthesis that imprisons us in mortality. That is, in a material concept of life. The parenthesis, then, consists of the degree of limitation in which we live. It consists of the degree of mental or material limitation we accept through the universal belief in two powers. In the degree, for instance, that we become more and more aware of the fact that spirit is the only power, in that degree is the parenthesis lighter in structure. In the degree that we realize I do not have a separate life of my own or separate consciousness, but that God constitutes my being, in that degree does the parenthesis become lighter, fading, fading, fading. With every spiritual realization we have, with every meditation that results in a conscious contact with God, the parenthesis is growing fainter, fading out. Eventually, in the final conscious union with our source, comes the complete elimination of the parenthesis. The practical aspects of that. Every healing, every spiritual healing, takes place in the degree that we can let the patient out of the parenthesis in our consciousness. In the degree that we hold a patient as a human being whom we are trying to instruct or purify or heal or reform or enrich or employ, in that degree we are merely changing the nature of the parenthesis from a difficult parenthesis to a happy one, from a poor parenthesis to a rich one, a sick parenthesis to a healthy one. But we have not removed the individual from the parenthesis. Therefore, it has not been a spiritual healing. A spiritual healing is one in which we do not take the patient or the claim into our consciousness. Immediately that the request for help comes, we are outside the parenthesis, seeing God as constituting individual being, God as the law, life, activity, substance of individual being, and with our own vision up here, not on a human being, not on a healing ministry, but on a realizing ministry. In that degree, we have lifted the patient out of the parenthesis, and now we have a spiritual healing, because we not only have what appears as the physical, mental, moral, financial healing, but we have a state of consciousness opened to spiritual awareness. Regardless of the effect that it may have on the individual, on the patient, our success is in proportion as we lift the patient out of the parenthesis, out of the human limitation, out of even the healthy and wealthy human limitation, and can perceive that Christ is the individuality of all being. Christ is the nature of all being, and release our patient and our student from the parenthesis. You first must see that the parenthesis means the degree of human limitation in which we are surrounded. And then removing the parenthesis means unseeing the human picture, the human selfhood, and being consciously aware of the spiritual selfhood. You see then that what we are really dealing with ourselves, is removing ourselves from that parenthesis. First of all, before we can lift anyone else from it, we must in some measure at least remove ourselves from it. In other words, come to the agreement that I am not living in any human form of limitation, time or space, calendars, climates. And the more we attain a living realization of the spiritual nature of our being, the fainter the parenthesis is that remains around us, the closer we are to becoming one in that complete infinity, eternity. Every meditation that results in a click is a fading out of the parenthesis. Every single experience in meditation makes us less subject to the limitations of the parenthesis, less subject to the calendar, less subject to climate, less subject to the economic conditions of the world. Many people say, does that mean you will not lose any money? It does not mean that at all. It means it does not make any difference to you if you do not have any money, regardless of whether anyone has money. We will always live and have our being with sufficiency and 12 baskets full left over. There is no way, as long as we have a human system of government and economics, there is no way of guaranteeing that that present government will survive. In fact, spiritual progress demands that every form be broken, no matter how good it is. One of the evils of living inside this parenthesis is that we resist every change. We want to live in such a parenthesis as long as it is halfway comfortable. Oh, it does not have to be healthy, wealthy, and wise. If it just has enough to get by on, then the pain is not too bad. Human nature resists change, and spiritual demonstration compels change. It breaks up the old patterns continuously, no matter how comfortable they may be, because the nature of spirit is infinity, and it is not going to let us rest in some degree of finiteness, even if that finiteness should be what the world calls $1 million or its equivalent. To spirit, that is still finiteness. It does not mean that it is going to give you 2 million. It means that it is going to give you greater freedom, greater harmony, less dependence on material forms and limitations. So it is that it is inevitable that just as our former form of government was broken up to present us with this socialistic state under which we now live, so this must be broken up someday. Advancing, evolving consciousness would make it clear that it is going to be an improved state. That improvement can hardly come, as it should come, as a natural evolution of progress, because the humans are too determined to hold on to what they have, and they will not give up their limitation for something else. We witnessed that, those of us who are old enough to remember it, in the days when our benevolent government had a WPA in which it gave men $14 a week to live on for their families, and believe it or not, our dear working men would not give it up. No, they were determined to hold on to their $14 a week even though they were half starving. Well, their argument was half is better than nothing. But you see, that is human limitation. Half is not better than nothing. It is far better to have nothing and be striving for something than it is to be continuously living with half of something. But human nature being what it is, you will find that it is our human nature to try to hold on to our past, to hold on to our present limitations, and not be willing to break through for something else. If we were willing to surrender each day what we had yesterday, we would find something better tomorrow. But our very attempts to hold on to what we had make Spirit take it away from us by force. That is why these transitional governments in Africa are going through these stresses. Their transition from colonial government to freedom should have been one of peace and harmony. Oh no. There were too many striving to hold on to some of the good that they had under colonialism and could not accept the fullness of their freedom. So it is that we are attempting by our spiritual life to remove the parenthesis, and the only way in which we can do it harmoniously and without pain is by allowing the changes to come without living in the past, without trying to hold on to the past, and not believing that every change means a lack of demonstration, even though it may temporarily mean a lack of some of the material demonstration, because the spiritual universe has a different set of values than the material. It comes back to nowness, living in the now and not trying to hug to ourselves the tatters of what we wore yesterday. Do you see how, if we, as this small group, can perceive the nature of this lesson and practice it, how we make it possible for all human consciousness to make the transition because we are the leavening influence? Then, as those who hear these tapes take on the same responsibility, because they also will be small groups listening to them, and they individually give up their yesterdays and their tomorrows for a spiritual experience that they are to experience in meditation now, and then keep on living in the realization that the grace of God is functioning now, they in their way become the leaven, until all of human consciousness begins a process of being lifted out of the parenthesis. Thank you.